If you're into podcasts, you should check out our podcast, Criminally Listed Presents Into the Killing. It's about cold cases that were eventually solved. New episodes are released every other week. It's available on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, Stitcher, and anywhere you find your favorite podcasts. Number 3. The Carlisle Earthquake. On December 4th, 1979, a passenger train was traveling through the Scottish Highlands from Inverness in the north to Perth in the south. The train arrived at its destination safely 3 hours after its departure. A train crash is not the disaster associated with this story. When the train arrived in Perth, the conductor checked the tickets of those aboard. But one man didn't have a ticket, and while traveling by rail without one isn't a capital offense, it's enough of a no-no that the conductor called the police on the fellow. When officers arrived to suss out the situation, the ticketless man seemed upset and out of sorts. The man, who called himself Edward Pearson, said he travelled from Wales and he needed to speak to Malcolm Rifkin about an urgent matter. Not knowing who Malcolm Rifkin was, the police duly loaded Mr. Pearson into a car and took him to the Perth Sheriff's Station. They told him not to worry, as they were sure the man would only have to pay a small fine and then he would be on his way. But the man grew more agitated while he waited in his cell. Soon the officers came to escort Mr. Pearson to court. When the judge and local sheriff, Harold F. Ford, called the man forward, Mr. Pearson explained that he needed to speak to Malcolm Rifkin as soon as possible. There was no time to lose. Sheriff Ford knew who Malcolm Rifkin was. He was the government's Minister of the Environment. But why did Mr. Pearson need to see Minister Rifkin so badly? Edward Pearson explained that there was going to be an earthquake and he needed Rifkin to do something about it. A murmur rose from the court's gallery, which included local reporters from the Dundee Telegraph and the Courier and Advertiser. Harold Ford banged his gavel. And just how, Sheriff Ford asked the man's court-appointed barrister, did Mr. Pearson know there was going to be an earthquake? His lawyer, Therese Canning, took a deep breath. Because he claims he is the prophet Elijah, she said. Laughter arose from the gallery. When it stopped, the judge patiently informed Mr. Pearson that earthquakes were extremely uncommon in Scotland. In fact, since 1800, a span of 180 years, there had only been 5 earthquakes in Scotland that would have been considered today as above 4 on the Richter scale. So Ford informed the man he had nothing to worry about. But perhaps Edward Pearson did have a reason to worry. In 1879, there were vast stores of nuclear waste buried in the north of England, just a few hundred kilometers away. An earthquake would threaten to break the containments, poisoning the land for generations. Sheriff Ford remanded Mr. Pearson to custody and ordered a psychological evaluation. The next day's paper ran the headline, "Prophet in Custody," and it recounted the strange story of Mr. Pearson and his odd prophecy. Eventually, Mr. Pearson was released from custody without ever getting to warn Malcolm Rifkin or anyone else working at the Ministry of the Environment. In fact, he simply vanished. Then, 3 weeks later, on December 26, at 3 minutes to 4 in the morning, workers at the Institute of Geological Sciences in Edinburgh felt the first tremors of what would be called the Boxing Day quake. It set their pens off the scale, Dr. Chris Bowett told the Guardian newspaper at the time. Across central Scotland, brick chimneys crumbled to the ground and masonry walls collapsed. One tenement in Glasgow suffered a massive crack that ran from the roof to the foundation. 6 families had to be evacuated and were left homeless by the quake. The bed was on casters and started rolling around the room, a woman named Patricia Grant told the media. Worried citizens jumped out of their beds and immediately contacted the police, who were flooded with calls. People were clearly worried, a police spokesperson said. Some thought there had been a plane crash, or that the nuclear power plant at Winskill had blown up. But engineers of the nuclear power station and the nuclear waste storage facilities thankfully reported no damage. The quake measured between 4.5 and 5 on the Richter scale. And no one was killed or seriously injured, scientists said, because the epicenter of the rumbler lay about 15 kilometers down inside the Earth. Any closer to the surface, they warned, and things would have been a lot worse. The next day, the Courier and Advertiser ran the headline, "Shaken Scots Tell of Earthquake Alarm." But there was no mention of Edward Pearson, nor his prophetic warning 3 weeks before. Number 2. Flight 182. On Sunday, September 4th, 1978, a young woman named Shawn Robbins awoke from a terrifying dream. "I saw a plane soaring in the sky. The destination was California," she later said. "I had a feeling this disaster was going to happen. It would be the United States' worst in history." But for Robbins, a self-styled ESP counselor, such dreams weren't necessarily out of the ordinary. She developed something of a knack, she said, for predicting plane crashes. According to her 1980 memoir, Ahead of Myself, Robbins relates the story from the early 1970s, long before she became a professional psychic. While working as a consultant for a large marketing company, Robbins' job was to analyze new products and forecast what kinds of sales companies could expect. When her predictions started coming in as surprisingly accurate, she got a raise. But one day, after a particularly vivid dream, she called her boss. Her prediction, she said, wasn't about a product, but a plane crash. She asked her boss if that meant anything to him. To her surprise, her boss related that he and a number of the company's executives were about to fly to Denver for an important meeting. "Don't get on that plane," Robbins recalls warning him. "Don't let anyone get on that plane." Given her track record for uncanny predictions, the boss believed her and canceled the meeting. That plane did end up crashing because the flight was never taken. Robin writes that later, her boss told her mechanics went over the plane with a fine-tooth comb and found a potentially disastrous problem with one of the engine's fuel pumps. Now, say what you will about kitchen psychics relaying unverifiable stories about their amazing predictions long after the fact. But the dream Robbins had later about the massive California plane crash was 100% before the disaster in question. We know about this because she told tens of thousands of people about it live over the air. On Monday, September 25th, the morning after her terrifying night vision, Robbins was a guest on a 9 a.m. radio call-in show hosted by longtime radio personality Buddy Dean. Dean was a legend of Arkansas broadcasting on Pine Bluff's KOTN AM station, and he had an impeccable reputation in the area. During the radio show, Robbins admitted that her dream for the night before was still bothering her. She felt compelled to share it not only with Dean, but his listeners as well. We were on the air, and she said she had a dream that there was going to be a major air disaster, and she emphasized the word major, Dean told In Search Of in 1980. Dean added that he didn't think much of it during the interview, until 3 hours later, at 12 p.m. Eastern, when he was driving home from the station and turned on the news. It was then he heard a breaking report about Pacific Southwest Airlines Flight 182. On September 25, 1978, PSA's Boeing 727 was on approach to San Diego International Airport when it collided with a wayward Cessna 172. The collision severed the 727's rudder controls as it ripped away a portion of the right wing. The pilot struggled to control the aircraft as it descended into a high-populated neighborhood, but it was no use. The plane was unresponsive. The black box recorded pilot James McFerrin's last words, "Ma, I love you," before the plane slammed into the ground, killing all 135 souls on board and 7 on the ground. Our telephones at the radio station completely went insane, Buddy Dean reported. It turned Pine Bluffs upside down. Not only had Sean Robbins gotten the location of the crash right, California, but also the scope of the crash. PSA Flight 182 was recorded as the worst airline disaster in United States history. But a mere 5 months later, in spring 1979, Robbins had another dream about another air disaster. One that would surpass the tragedy of Flight 182 and take out the mantle as the worst ever American air disaster. Only this time, Robbins wasn't alone in her prediction. Number 1. Flight 191. Tuesday, May 15th, 1979. 22-year-old David Booth sat bolt upright in his bed, covered in sweat. Like Sean Robbins before him, he just had a dream in which he watched a massive jumbo jet hurtling towards Earth. What made the dream unsettling, he said, was the jet in the dream was eerily silent. It just wasn't making the sound that it should, Booth later said. Thinking not much more about it, Booth went back to sleep. But the dreadful feeling he experienced in his dream stayed with him all the next day. And later that night, he dreamed again of the falling passenger plane. Only this time, the plane in his dream began to silently bank, rolling onto its side, then its back, before crashing upside down into the ground with a massive explosion. This time, he says, he woke up crying. It was as if I was being compelled to do something, Booth said in 1980, to act fast. But what could he do? He wasn't an important person. He was a simple office worker who had a crazy dream. Who would even listen to him if he decided to call someone, to perhaps warn them? Booth tried again to put the dream out of his mind, until it happened for the 3rd night in a row, and then a 4th, and a 5th. Finally, after having the same tragic dream for 7 nights in a row, Booth knew he had to at least tell someone, anyone. In the phone book, Booth found the number for the offices of the Federal Aviation Administration in Cincinnati, Ohio, where he was put through to facilities manager Paul Williams, who, to Booth's surprise, actually took his dire warning seriously, partially because he later said Booth's description of the plane seemed very precise. He described to me, by name, as an American Airlines plane with an engine on the tail, Williams said. Given that only a few planes at the time had engines on their tail, Williams surmised that the plane in Booth's dream was a Boeing 727. The same model plane that crashed in San Diego exactly 8 months earlier. Williams urged Booth to remember as many details as he could from the dream. While he set about trying to find out which American Airlines 727s were in service and where. But as Booth experienced the dream again on the 8th, 9th, and 10th night in a row, he grew frustrated because the image of the plane in each dream was always the same. Just a large jumbo jet with an engine on the tail. On the morning after the 10th night, Booth said he couldn't get any work done at the office. Even though it was the Friday of an upcoming 3-day weekend, there was still lots to do. All day, he was hoping for a call from Williams, saying they had found the plane in question and that a disaster had been averted. The call came later that day, on Friday, May 25th, 1979. But it wasn't the call Booth was hoping for. At 4 p.m. Eastern, 3 p.m. in Chicago, American Airlines Flight 191 took off from O'Hare Airport en route to Los Angeles, but just as it cleared the runway, the plane's left wing engine somehow detached. The plane lost control and banked onto one side. Witnesses on the ground reported that the plane's remaining right-wing engine and tail engine shut off, and they watched in horror as the DC-10 silently turned upside down before crashing into the ground with a massive explosion. The accident killed all 271 people on board the plane, as well as 2 people on the ground, making it the newest, worst, non-terrorist-related airline disaster in U.S. history, a depressing record it still holds today. Meanwhile, Booth was trying to make sense of what he was hearing. As Williams explained, they had gotten the model of the airplane wrong. It wasn't a 727 as Williams had thought. 727s have engines that are technically in the tail, not on the tail. Flight 191 was a DC-10 with an engine on the tail, just as David Booth described. Hearing about this tiny difference, Booth said he fell apart. David blamed himself for not being able to gather more information, Williams said later. I tried to tell him he couldn't blame himself. We made an attempt, but we failed. Amazingly, David Booth wasn't the only one who had a strange experience with Flight 191. Television actress Lindsay Wagner, aka the Bionic Woman, had a ticket to travel on the flight that day. But at the last minute, she had a feeling that she wanted to visit her sister in Portland, Oregon instead. It was a decision that saved her life. Everybody thought it was on that flight, Wagner said in 2016, so there was a lot of relief. Writer Judith Wax was one of the passengers who wasn't so lucky that day. Wax and her husband had been heading to LA for a booksellers convention. She was celebrating the release of her first book, a humorous memoir called Starting in the Middle. The book was published on May 1st, 1979, a mere 3 weeks before the accident. One passage in her book reads, "When my job required travel, I developed such a fear of airplanes, my head trembled from takeoff to landing." If you have the first edition of that book, that passage can be found on page 191. Thank you so much for watching this video. We hope you found it interesting. If you did find it interesting, please make sure you subscribe. We'll have a new video about the paranormal every week. If you just discovered this channel, please make sure you check out our other channel, Criminally Listed. We have over 325 videos featuring bizarre but true crime stories. You can find it at youtube.com/criminallylisted. Thanks again for watching.